The .NET Core podcast is supported by our listeners who have become patrons. To see a full list of the patrons, or to join them, head over to .NETCore.show/patrons. Hello everyone and welcome to the .NET Core podcast, an award-winning podcast where we reach into the core of the .NET technology stack and, with the help of the .NET community, present you with the information that you need in order to grok the many moving parts of one of the biggest cross-platform multi-application frameworks on the planet. I am your host, Jamie Gebruckman-Taylor. In this episode, I talked with Nick Proud about the work he has been doing with robotic process automation and document processing with Azure Cognitive Services. Although there are tons of services, libraries, and solutions for reading through and programmatically reasoning about a corpus of documents, the Azure Cognitive Services Form Recognizer seemed to fit both the problem and solution that Nick was working on. Along the way, we talked about how robotic process automation, or RPA, is a reduction in toil or busy work for people, which allows them to focus on the task at hand. We talked about our own personal definitions of the term full-stack developer, and we talked about how important it is to look at a number of possible supporting libraries and services when approaching a new problem, rather than attempting to shoehorn a library or service into the solution just because you're familiar with it. Sometimes we developers have to step outside of our comfort zones and attack a problem in a unique way, and that's one of the key takeaways from this episode. So let's sit back, open up a terminal, type in .NET U Podcast, and let the show begin. So thank you ever so much, Nick, for spending some time in your afternoon joining us on the show. I really genuinely appreciate it. I say that in every single episode, but I really do genuinely appreciate people taking the time out to talk to me and to talk to the listeners as well. It's
an absolute pleasure.
Very kind of you.
Thank you very much.
Hey, no worries. Yeah, I mean, let's share the knowledge. That's what I'm all about, right?
Yeah.
If someone walks away from this having learned one thing, I'm good.
Mm-hmm.
That's how I do it. Excellent. Okay, so I wonder if you wouldn't mind sharing a little bit of information about yourself. You know, like a little elevator pitch about Nick. Maybe some of the work that you do, a little bit of background, that kind of thing. Is that all right?
Yeah, that's cool. So, yeah, I'm Nick. I've been working as a software developer for probably about 10 years now. In tech for about 10 years. So I'm currently the head of software development for an RPA company. So most of my work's been very sort of specialized towards RPA, so robotic process automation. And, we can talk a bit more about what that means if you like. But recently, my work's required me to work a lot more with Azure. And so, I've been delving into the various cognitive services that Azure provides, and it's blown me away, really, some of the things that we can do now. One of the things we're working with a lot is document processing. So it's been a lot of finding ways to quickly get information from documents. So I'm a big C# person, big fan of the language. It's my main language, but I would consider myself a full stack developer, but that's kind of loose term these days. It's very difficult to define. But yeah, I guess that's me in quite a large nutshell.
No, I get that. I'm still very much of the opinion that and people can complain at me if they want, but it's an opinion, right? Everybody's got an opinion. Full stack developers can't exist because, all right, the front end technology is probably JavaScript or Blazor, but just saying JavaScript, you've got React, Vue, Svelte, exactly. Angular. You know what I mean? And to say that you are a full stack developer, to me, says I know enough of all of these technologies to be dangerous with them or to be able to build something with them.
Yeah.
But that requires a lot of, and I'm not saying it can't be done, but that requires a lot of patience and time and investment to learn those technologies and then to semantically separate them in your own knowledge and experience. So if people can do that, fantastic. I can't. So I'm server-side specialist is me. I'm happy with just going, nope, it's React. I haven't got a clue. You know?
Yeah,
But
I think for me, like especially when I'm hiring, when they're looking for this, when we're using this term full stack developer, I kind of hate using it, but I kind of have to because the market expects it. So I always try and make it really clear that when I refer to someone as full stack, it's more that they have experience in picking up frameworks quickly. So for me, being able to jump into Angular and being like, okay, I get what this is. I can run with the documentation. That for me would qualify. It is a very gatekeepery term, but it's also expecting way too much of people. I think, like you say, like if you were to expect that a full stack person knows all the JavaScript frameworks, it's just not a thing. It's just I don't even see that as being possible because a new one comes out every 3 minutes.
yeah. I think I made this joke on an earlier episode, but in the time we've been talking, 19 different JavaScript frameworks have been created and then abandoned, right?
Of course, yeah. GitHub is just bloating.
Absolutely. And they all use left pad. No,
Of course they do.
oh my goodness. But yeah, I totally appreciate that. So that's the thing, right? I feel like maybe as developers, maybe we need ubiquitous language, right?
Yeah.
Rather than having ubiquitous language to help us deal with customers and clients and users, maybe we need it, right? Because like I said, right, my description of what full stack means is different to what your description of full stack means.
Yeah, definitely. And it's down to the same sort of debate about what is a junior developer versus a senior developer. To me, there's no specific definition. A senior developer at my company might be a junior at another company. It totally depends on what you're doing. So, yeah, I really dislike the labels, but unfortunately, in my position, I kind of have to use them because people just don't. We don't, like you say, we don't have that ubiquitous language for those specific areas.
Yeah, I think perhaps our now this is me just intellectualizing, and I shouldn't do that because I'm not an intellectual. But like maybe because like our industry has come from engineering, right? Where if you're a structural engineer, you go from being someone who is more junior into a senior role when you have enough varied experience. But the set of things you can get varied experience with are very, from my perspective as an outsider, are rather limited, right? Whereas because we said it just before we started, every company is a software company, right? And so your varied experience may be more varied than my varied experience, or vice versa. And does that mean that my varied experience is somehow inferior to yours? Does that mean that your varied experience is inferior to mine? And I think that's the problem, is because we're all solving slightly different versions of the same problem, but with billions of different types of technologies and frameworks and where it's hosted and how it's been built up and all these kinds of millions of different variables. Whereas, and I'm going to reduce structural engineering quite a lot here, but when you build a bridge, there will be a specific prescription of steps you have to go through to build the bridge. And it won't be that it changes slightly because you're building a bridge for one company and then you go to a different company, you build a bridge there and they have a completely different process, right? So maybe we need some like guidance from other engineering, or maybe we shouldn't think of ourselves as engineers. I don't know. It's, like I say, intellectualizing it's for people way smarter than me to figure out.
We're getting philosophical now, Jamie. This is big.
Absolutely. It's starting to sound like an episode of Tabs and Spaces. That's what it
is. Wait, that's not what this is? No, I'm joking.
No, it's not. So you talked about robotic process automation. So would you mind quickly just running through what that is real quick, just to set like a baseline, just in case someone's listening in and going, those are words, definitely those are words, and they arrange in a very pleasing order, but I don't know what the actual phrase means. So would you mind just sort of setting that base level?
Yeah, sure. So it's got the word robotic in it, but it doesn't refer to robotics as you would know it in a more mainstream way. So essentially, robotic process automation is I wouldn't say it's an emerging field, but it's gaining a lot of traction. It's been around for quite a while, but I think it's becoming more mainstream. It's the automation of repeatable business processes. So a lot of people argue, well, isn't that what software is anyway? But it's more specific to things that human beings would normally do manually. So specifically on a computer. So one good use case, I think, is one that we work with a lot, which is like invoice processing or some finance back office task. Like, what does the human do? They look at an invoice, they take the data from it, they interpret it using their knowledge of the domain, and then they input that data into a system like Sage. So robotic process automation encompasses translating those human processes into ones governed by software. So the robotic element comes in because when we've created this program which performs those tasks, we refer to it as a bot, and it's robotic because it's repeatable. And so you have to be careful not to stray into AI territory, because this is much more like I'm following a script. There is a concept of intelligent automation, which again we can talk about, but at its base level, it's, we map out a process that would normally be carried out by a human. We write some software that does the same thing, and it's usually geared towards going as far as emulating mouse clicks and sending keystrokes and things like that. So literally, if your job was to double click an icon, open an application, type some data in, then we'd be writing software which does exactly the same thing. Now, obviously, there's some controversy around that, because people often react with, well, are you just trying to write me out of a job? It's a big subject. But one of the things we're trying to do at our company is work on the philosophy that it's not intended to replace people, but it's actually intended to remove the more menial aspects of someone's job. So someone who's in finance could be have a fantastic analytical mind, or someone who could be really good at solving problems, but they're spending most of their day doing data entry. Well, they don't need to be doing that. They could be doing the more important things. And there's always going to be an element of this will save us money in people. But I think that's always been something that's been there with technology to a certain extent. And it's just meant that the markets had to change. So yeah, robotic process automation at the moment has some big players like UiPath, Automation Anywhere, and these are like low-code solutions that allow you to drag and drop commands together to build what we would call a bot that fulfills a process. And I guess at its core, that's what RPA is.
Okay, cool. There's a couple of really interesting things that you've said that I've inferred. I've inferred some things from what you've said there. The first is it's really interesting that a couple episodes ago at the date of recording, we had an AMA, like an Ask Me Anything, and one of the questions was, what is the future of, what's the next 5 years of development look like? And I'd said in that episode that I think low code, no code is like the next step. This idea of, like you say, you're dragging some commands around, do this, then do this, then do this. And I think it may not be the next step of drag the low code, no code blocks around, and then suddenly a fully working, protected, 100% wonderful app comes out the other end. This isn't to say that low code, no code doesn't do that, but I feel like perhaps you need a human in the loop, like an engineer or a business analyst or something, that actually goes, right, okay, let's just tweak these things to make it a little bit more safe or secure or something. Like, let's say you have a system where it's like, move to this very specific point on the screen and double click to open the icon, right? Well, what about if you move the icon?
Mm-hmm. That's it.
And I think that was one of the problems with like macros. There were many problems in macros, but one of the problems with macros in like Microsoft Word or whatever is if you moved a toolbar, your macro no longer worked, and things like that.
Yeah. The human in the loop phrase that you used is one that we use all the time. So one of the big parts of what I'm doing at the moment is we're trying to solve the problem of making it easy to introduce humans to an automation process. So, historically in an RPA project, if there was some kind of like business exception or something that didn't happen according to plan, which is going to happen because the robot is only as good as what you tell it to do and the information that you give it. it's been very difficult to bring someone in to tell it what to do next and to catch that. And if you could, then, like you say, it was usually a developer or a business analyst. And those people don't necessarily know the domain. Like if we're still using the finance example, you bring Bob from development in, well, he's got to go and speak to Simon in finance to find out specifically what's going on. So what we've done is we've created a web application where the bots can post analytics, so they can see nice things like this is how much time you've saved, this is how many processes you've got running at the moment, but also a kind of inbox to say these events have happened that require human intervention, and then you can address them and send them back. So that's a quite, I think, novel area of RPA that hasn't been explored as much. Because it's been very much developer centric, whereas this makes it more end user centric. If anything, it makes it so that we acknowledge that humans are always going to have to play a part in these processes.
I like that. I do, because I can't see it directly from the end user's point of view, but if I am a person in the business and I'm worried that this system's going to replace me, including me in that may make me feel a little bit more relaxed about, well, actually, A, it's not perfect, and B, there are other parts to what I'm doing anyway that still need to be, because you can't automate every single part of a business, right? Because there's one of the things that I tell people all the time is that there are like fuzzy parts of your organization that don't quite fit in any kind of logic.
Mm-hmm.
You don't realize are there, and it might not be your business. It might just be your operation. It might be a department. There'll be something that isn't automatable, and that's just down to the way the business works, not because it can't be automated, just because of the way the business works. And so I feel like keeping people involved in that decision, keeping the people involved in the process, keeping people actually working with it is a great idea. And I feel like there was something that you'd said that, again, I'm inferring, you didn't say this exactly, but you talked about how if you've got someone in finance, they might be spending their whole day doing data entry rather than the actual, the finance part of the work that they do. In development, you may say, oh, well, I'm in meetings all the time instead of doing development. But, we deal with people. But the thing that I took from that is that perhaps this is a way to sort of reduce toil. So like it's the busy work that you have to do in order to get you to do the work that you are like your main objective for being there today. That kind of thing.
So sort of orchestrating your job in a way. Yeah.
I like it. Okay, so we talked about what RPA is. So how does this fit into Azure, however you want to say it, the cognitive services stuff?
I never know whether to say Azure or Azure. I feel like our American friends say Azure, don't they? And I started off saying Azure, but then I can never decide. But I'm going to go with Azure because.
Okay, fair enough.
But
the transcription for this episode is going to be brilliant. It's going to be Azure, 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 Azure.
Also, Azure.
Yeah.
But yeah, so primarily one of the big reasons that we looked at Azure is that we're a very new business, and so when I joined, the business was already going for about a year, and they were pivoting away from reselling automation products, and they wanted to make their own. But obviously, time is really important, and so having something to get you quick to market is integral. So we looked at a lot of open source solutions that we could use as a basis for building our own bot technology, really, and that was all in .NET, which is great because I'm a .NET developer primarily. So we're still in that world of .NET, and so when we engaged with our first customers, we found that most of the clients we were seeing were looking at document processing. So most of their processes involved some kind of digitized paper, whether that's an invoice, could be someone's personal details for a pension. It could be anything really. But the sort of constant was it was some kind of document. And so we needed to be able to quickly parse that document with OCR. So when I joined, Abby was in use, which is an OCR solution, which is very proven. It's very mature, but I think it was kind of overkill for our use case, and so we needed to find something that fit in with this pay-as-you-go sort of billing that we wanted to bring in, because that's also something which is quite new for RPA. The idea that you only pay for what you consume. We're trying to pass on those cost reductions to our customers. So Azure was a really good choice in that sense, because it offers these APIs that are just sort of fire and forget. You just chuck a document at it, and what comes back is just JSON. But in reality, this really amazing artificial intelligence system has just ran just for you, and it cost you like pence or cents. So that was a kind of no-brainer for us, and it's now an integral part of our stack. So the main one being the Azure Form Recognizer component. Because OCR is hard, it's really difficult, and not only can we get I wouldn't say instant response, but we're talking seconds, with a really well structured JSON object, which gives us all the integral information about the document. There's also these pre-built machine learning models for specific document types, so we can go as granular as saying, okay, the document we're dealing with is an invoice. So just use Microsoft's invoice machine learning, because they've done all the hard work for us. And so, that's huge for us in terms of accelerating. Obviously, we also have the option to do the custom training. So if you've got a very complicated document which is relatively consistent, then we can train the document ourselves if we want to. But again, just having that flexibility, and then turning what is or was 10 years ago a pretty big data science activity into just an API call, means that we can do a lot in a very short space of time. So yeah, I think that's probably why we gravitated towards it. Obviously, AWS and Google have similar sort of provisions as well, but being a .NET shop, it just sort of made sense.
That makes sense. And I feel like if somebody was to say to me 4 or 5 years ago, all of the big providers will be providing machine learning as a service, which is essentially what this is, or at least the Azure Cognitive Services stuff. Because I've looked into it for transcriptions for the podcast, because obviously I want as many people to be able to consume it as possible. So if you don't know, there's a transcription that comes along with the podcast. It is on the website. I am looking at ways of embedding it into the audio, but not many of the podcast audio players support that at the moment. And so there's a couple of competing standards. And so what I'm doing is I'm kind of doing it the wrong way, which is waiting for a standard to win, right? Which is kind of what you do. But then it means that, the listeners are then left in the dark with, well, how do I actually consume this? But so there's a machine-built transcription for each episode, and I'm paying for a service that does it for me. But there's an Azure speech to text, there's a Google speech to text, and there's an Amazon speech to text, and there are several others. There's even an open source app you can run on your computer, but you need to bring along the model, right? And I think my understanding, and this may be incorrect, is that before you can use a machine learning system, you have to build up a corpus of model data that's the example that I was once told was, in order to teach the computer what a cat looks like, you have to show it 1,000, 10,000, 1,000,000 pictures of a cat in different positions, different places, different breeds of cat, different color patterns of cat, because it's only after those 10,000 pictures, 1,000,000 pictures, that the computer is able to figure out what the features that make up a cat, like the pointy ears or the whiskers or whatever. And even then, depending on your data set, you'll only get maybe 98, 99% accuracy, because there could have been some outlier image that's like a person dressed as a cat or something that kind of messes your data set up. Is that, do you know whether that's what they've done? Obviously not with cats, but with invoices or something.
Yeah, I can't speak whether they've got a dedicated. They've definitely not got a dedicated endpoint for cats. I can give you that, but they So I mean, this is only me surmising it, but I would say that they've taken a huge sample set of invoices, and then they also do identity documents as well, so passports and things like that. and they've done the machine learning modeling ahead of time. So their job is to upkeep those models, and we see that in the release of new versions periodically. So the team that actually consumes this tech, that builds the sort of RPA projects for customers, recently put a DevOps item in for me to update the version that it was using, because it's been proven that the models are just better in that version. So it's kind of making it so that we have to say, are we using the latest models? But that is such a huge time saver. But also, we still have the issue of, well, what if their models don't contain modeling for a specific document that we want to process? And we have seen that. We're not only processing invoices, and documents don't always have those consistent layouts. That's a huge issue when it comes to things like OCR. But we've even found a way around that. The obvious way to do it is to train custom models, but then you've got to do a training set for every different kind of layout that you encounter, which we did actually try for a while, and which was frankly crazy. And obviously, all it takes is for one of those layouts to slightly change, and you're back to square one, or at least your data becomes less reliable. So just as I was beginning to despair, Microsoft updated their document analysis endpoint as well, which was, again, just an API that focused on just generic document metadata. So straight away, if I had a field on an invoice, for example, that wasn't being picked up because it's not a invoicey, inverted quotes, kind of field, then I could do a second call to a different endpoint and just say, give me all the fields, and then I'll just look for that field in that. So then I don't have to mess around with a different training set. I just do 2 API calls instead of 1, and the cost implication is negligible. And you were talking about confidence levels as well, in terms of how reliable the data was. So how confident am I that it's not a grown man dressed as a cat as opposed to a cat? That's another fantastic thing about the way Microsoft outputs the data from this API, is that they give you the confidence score for every single item they've extracted. So we can make that decision programmatically to say, we're happy with a threshold of 80% confidence. And if it's below that, then we reject that document as being unsafe. So even though they've done a lot of the work ahead of time with the machine learning, they still give us a lot of control by giving us some really verbose data. So yeah, I'm a huge fan of it.
If you're enjoying this show, would you mind sharing it with a friend or colleague? Check out Podcatcher for a link to the show notes, which has an embedded player within it and a transcription and all that stuff, and share that link with them. I'd really appreciate it if you could indeed share the show. But if you'd like a few other ways to support it, you could leave a rating or review on your podcatcher of choice. So if you head over to .netcore.show/review, you'll find loads of ways to do that. You could consider buying the show a coffee. The Buy Me a Coffee link is available on each show's show notes page on the website. This is a one-off financial support option. You could become a patron. This is a monthly subscription-based financial support option, and the link to that is included on each episode show notes page as well. I'd love it if you could share the show with a friend or colleague, or leave a rating or review. The other options are completely up to you and are not required at all to continue enjoying the show. Anyway, let's get back to it. So here's what I like about that is it's something you said earlier on. It saves all this time, right? You said something along the lines of 10 years ago, this would have been an NP hard problem to solve. This would have been a non-trivial thing to solve, because you would have had to, or a team of data scientists would have had to come in, create a system that could then learn from your document, your source document set, and build that machine learning model. Whereas, like you said, all that hard work is done for you. You can then actually focus on solving the actual problem, which is, here's this block of this purple block that lives somewhere in the cloud. We throw a document at it, and then we throw a document at it, and then we get the information out that we need.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, it's it's an invoice for this much going to this person, due on this date, and whether it was paid or not, perhaps. You get all of that information straight back, and that feels like it's. See, to me, we talked a little earlier on about the worry with RPA, and it there's the worry of it replacing jobs. I feel like it enhances them.
Mm-hmm.
We talked about reducing toil, right? And that, like, looking through, if you've got 1,001 invoices to action today, and it takes you 2 minutes to do each one, that's 2002 minutes that it's going to take you to get through that pile of stuff.
Yeah.
If you can throw it at a system which can deal with, even if it can, I'm not saying your system can't, but even if it can only deal with, say, half of those, and it takes a minute to do all of that half, you've immediately halved your workload. I like that. I really do.
Yeah. The nice thing about it as well is that because we're doing it programmatically, we can, alongside that, we can track how long that's taken to do. So when we typically try to get an estimate from the companies that we're engaging with to say, on average, how long does this take you per document? And then we use that as a benchmark and say, okay, compare that to how long it took the bot to do it. And from that, we can generate a handling time. So we can see how much that's reduced your handling time. But what we've also seen recently is that because we're no longer focusing on just doing the task and we're analyzing something else that's doing the task, we've got the time to look at the data and say, maybe we're not doing that as efficiently as we could do it. Maybe our data isn't very clean. And so straight away, you've not only automated a process, but you've also found the time and the ability to analyze the way you do things, which again could be done by that person who used to do the data entry. They can focus on innovating and making processes better than just doing the process.
Yeah, and I feel like it's something that we do as developers all the time anyway, in our actual practice as developers. Like, who writes assembler, right? The people who get paid lots of money to write assembly. I can't speak for you, but I certainly don't write x86 assembler anymore.
Nah.
I mean, I used to. So for those who don't know, this is like the one step above the individual bytecode on your actual computer, right?
It's the code that you write if you hate yourself and your time.
Pretty much, yeah. But it's also like, if you want to eke out the most performance of your computer, you go right the way down to the machine code level and you write it at that level. But every line of code that you or I have ever written, and I'm pretty much, I could put my hand on heart and say any line of code that any of the listeners have ever written, has at some point before execution been converted down to that low level. Now, there's a big market for being able to write assembler, and that's great. But what's great about C#, Python, Go, all of these higher level languages, these more modern, sort of like, dare I say it, 21st century languages, is that they abstract all of that away, so you can actually get on with the problem at hand, which is displaying the word "hello world" on screen, or dealing with, get me this document and give me the data back, right? And by abstracting away, you're allowing that worker, that person whose usual day job is to deal with all of this big pile of documents, you're abstracting away the actual, like I said it earlier on, toil, and I'm sure you've said process several times. You're abstracting that away. You're saying, yeah, I will deal with that by pushing this button, right? Mm-hmm. But that, like you said, it gives me a chance to go away and actually talk about, maybe there's some, maybe I've had this pipe dream of always being able to, like, I can see that there is an inefficiency, and if I could get away from this big pile of work I have to do, I can solve the inefficiency, which will remove the big pile of work I always have to do, which allows me to do the work that some other work that I desperately need to do or want to do or whatever.
Yeah.
And it's almost like a force multiplier, I think.
Mm-hmm. I mean, it's to be honest, it's no different to any other kind of automation in history. I think, the further you go back in history, the more we've done manually, and I don't think this is really any different. It's probably, I mean, it still to some people feels like magic, but that's because they're so used to their everyday domain, and that's another thing that's made it really hard for us, is that it's so difficult to demo. Like, it's really hard to show this stuff if you're not making the bot click buttons and stuff like that. If we say, oh, you've got an API, amazing, that's like a dream for us, but it's also really hard to demo because it's all back end. And the same goes for this, really. But with form recognizer in particular, even though we've talked about how easy it makes things from a process perspective, so from the perspective of the person who used to do that process, it's not a trivial thing for the developer still. I mean, yes, we've got nice handy tools like APIs, and we've even got a really nice SDK for this as well, if you're a C# developer. But, you still have to handle, when requests fail, you still have to interpret the results, you still have to parse the JSON. So all those developer-y things still exist, and there's still other challenges that come with it. For example, when you call these endpoints, they don't give you a response in milliseconds like a lot of APIs do, because why would they? They have to go off and run these processes. So they instead give you this, it's quite cool, actually, I think. They give you back this sort of check back later URL. So they say, accepted your request, check back on this URL later. And then you can either just ping that URL, or if you're using the SDK, you can use specific methods to say, it has that request finished. And if it has, then you can parse it. And so you still have to build that mechanism to wait and to check to see if it's finished and all that stuff, which is cool. It's a nice challenge, but it's still there, So if anything, it's shifted a lot of the complexity to developers, which I think is right. But again, it's something all that stuff is really difficult to get across to the people who are consuming it.
Sure, yeah. I can imagine that it is. I guess it's not the same because it is kind of magic. It's an automated system, right? But like comparing typesetting from, the 1800s or the 1600s, I can't remember when the Gutenberg press was invented, right? You had to take a bunch of lead blocks, which were the characters but written backwards, or carved into it backwards. You had to lay those out across a row, run some ink over it, and then press it against the page. And then eventually, your words would come out.
Exactly.
But like 200 years later, we've got moving typewriters, right?
Yeah.
Which would have been seen as this is wizardry, because it's like instead of having to typeset the whole thing and run the ink over it, press the button. I'm greatly reducing the problem domain, of course, but like instead of having to do that, I can just literally and it's there, right? Or indeed Henry Ford, right? He didn't invent the automobile; he just sort of made it really economical. And he said, if I'd have listened to the customer, they'd have just asked me for faster horses. Right? And to people who were used to traveling about through either a horse-driven way, getting into a machine that then seems to be driving itself, I suppose might have been as magical, perhaps.
Yeah, definitely. I think it sounds grandiose, doesn't it? But I really do think it's true. Whenever my wife says it all the time, she lives in spreadsheets, and whenever people ask what does your husband do, she's like, well, he tries to write me out of a job. I'm like, no, not necessarily. I'm trying to make it so that you can do cooler stuff. But there will always be that kind of that not necessarily aggression towards automation, but fear, maybe fear. I think it's there, and it's and sometimes as well, people make the Skynet comparison as well. They're like, either you're trying to take my job, or you're trying to take over the world with artificial intelligence, and it's just so out there. It's funny, but it's yeah.
Excellent. Okay, so you talked about with these APIs and the SDKs that Azure give you, that presumably Google and AWS do something similar. You can send off something to be processed, and because it takes some time, you have to wait, and then there's a process for getting that data back. What does that data look like? Is it just like, here's some JSON without a schema and you're done, or is it like structured? Is it unstructured? Do you have to write custom parsers to get that data back? What's the because I can imagine if I'm saying to a system, here is my data, here is my file, give me the data back, I would want the data to be some kind of well-known structure, but then it doesn't know what I'm giving it. So how can it provide me with structured data? So is that the case?
Yeah, so it is very structured, But I think you get a different experience depending on whether you're using like straight REST calls with JSON or whether you're using the SDK, which I think is a pretty normal thing. That's quite normal for most APIs. I'd say, yes, it depends on your use case, but yes, there is a known structure. So, for example, if you call invoices, for example, if you're using the pre-built model, you'll always have a property called items, and that's going to be your line items, and that's an array. It's always going to be like that. You'll always have a field called vendor name, and it will always be named vendor name. So you're able to rely on that schema. And it's probably easier if you're using the SDK because you can just consume a more complex object in .NET. So you'd be able to just say invoice.vendor name. So yeah, that's the bit for me that makes it so compelling, is that you can just treat it like any other object. It's been I guess it's been doubly complicated for me because I do this call as part of a piece of software consumed by developers who are then not interested in the raw JSON that comes back, which is, as you can imagine, a huge object, especially if you call against the document analysis endpoint, which is just give me everything that's on the document, which could be tables, key value pairs. It even does entities. So it will recognize that a person was mentioned or an organization was mentioned, which is really cool. But for the developers who are consuming the objects I get back from Azure, they don't care about a lot of that stuff. They may just want key value pairs, or they may just want line items. And so there is a lot of JSON parsing I need to do just to cut down that response and give it to them in something they would consume as part of an RPA process, because they would just say, I get the response back, and then I take the line items into a data table, and I just write them into Sage. That's their automation. So yeah, I would say it has to be very structured and very it has to be a known structure. Otherwise, the whole thing just doesn't work. That's what separates it from other OCR solutions like Tesseract, for example, because that will just return any plain text that it sees. And sometimes it will just look like hieroglyphics if it's like a really poor quality document. And so, yeah, that's the difference for sure.
Okay. And then presumably with this almost like a POCO, right? It is a C# object, right? With this C# object, that gives you slightly more control over how to reason on the data, presumably, because you've said, here's a bunch of, maybe they're scans, maybe they're PDFs, maybe they're photographs, whatever. You've gone, here's a bunch of data, go sort it out. And then you get all of these POCOs back. You can then, that tells me that you can reason about that data, right? You can say, hey, I've uploaded 1,000 documents. They're all JPEGs, but guess what? I've got all the data now.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Yeah.
Is that how that works?
Yeah, and so there's also, in most cases, a need to refer back to the original document. And so what we do is you have a choice with Form Recognizer. You can either sort of serialize the data down to bytes and use the local file, or you can upload it to some other internet-based storage. I tend to use blob storage just because it's simpler, and then just give it a URL. And so we do that as part of our process. We'll upload the invoice to a secure blob storage, gives us a URL, and then we say to Azure Form Recognizer, use this URL to give me JSON for all the extracted data. And then because the data is just hours afterwards, once they've parsed it, obviously I talked earlier about how they need to raise these exceptions in the platform. And so what we do is we just take the extracted data, encode it as base64, which is not so much of a problem with is it raw string literals? That'll solve that problem soon. JSON within JSON and all that sort of stuff. And then we can just send that up to our MVC application, which is just an app service. And then we can decode that on the other side. So we can say in a web app, this is what the bot extracted. And then we can show an iframe to say, this is the original document. And so we wouldn't have been able to do that if we didn't have that structure that comes from the response from Form Recognizer.
I like it. One of the things that so you've mentioned a couple of OCR systems so far, and I want to give you the chance to say it because I'm worried that people are going to be like, but Abby is brilliant or Tesseract is brilliant, right? I feel like, as with everything in development, and please correct me if I'm wrong in my assumptions, it's just that those particular services and libraries didn't fit the solution you were trying to build, right? Whereas it feels from what you're saying that the Azure cognitive services and form recognizer fit your solution a little better.
Yeah,
Is
definitely.
that
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple of really big points on why it was just better for us. Abby is obviously very proven and it's a very mature technology, but it was kind of like I say, it was overkill because it was trying to do a lot of the things that our bot technology already did. So it was trying to evaluate the content that it had extracted and say, check for specific values and use rule-based extraction and all this sort of stuff. But we were already going to do that anyway. And we just needed to get the structured, the actual content in a structured manner. That was the only thing we needed. And so, I guess you can do that with Abby, but the way it was configured, it was kind of like if you did that, you would be underutilizing it. So that brings a financial aspect into it as well. The fact that we can just say, well, we pay a couple of pence per page, and therefore we can sort of anticipate how much it's going to cost us rather than having a license contract for a year or something like that. So, for some companies, that's perfect for them because they may have sort of regulatory things that say you need to use specific technology or it needs to be on premise. That's another thing about Abby is you can do it very well on premise. And so it's not that Abby's bad at all. I don't think that I have the authority to say that because I've not used it enough. But I know for sure that it just didn't fit our use case. And it's largely the same for things like, Amazon Textract is the sort of equivalent on the AWS side. But it's just that little bit more effort when we're already in Azure. And I guess that's kind of one of the advantages of being a cloud provider is that once you start using one resource, it becomes sticky. If you're using a SQL server, Azure SQL database, then you start looking at blob storage and then you start saying, oh, well, what's this AI stuff? And before you know it, you're kind of heavily invested in this ecosystem. Not to say that you have to just use one cloud provider, but it's similar to our strategy in the sense that once we've demonstrated how easy it is to automate one process, you're going to want to do another one. So yeah, it's very much the case. I agree. It's not that because Abby's an inferior technology at all. Far from it. It's very complex and it's quite impressive. Just overkill for us.
Sure, and I feel like there's an important lesson there for. I try to shy away from titles when I'm talking about developers too, but for those who are perhaps earlier in their career, just because a library exists, don't try to shoehorn the library into your solution, right?
Yeah.
Look for something that fits well with what you're attempting to build. That's what I would say. It sounds very much like you or someone on the team or someone somewhere has done their due diligence and said, look, there are these things, there are these libraries we could use, these systems we could use, but there's also this other one that we could also use. And perhaps, and I'm probably putting words into your mouth here, perhaps there's been some kind of discovery work that's happened and you've gone, actually, we think it would work better with this system only because this system has these benefits and these drawbacks, but these other systems which already exist have these benefits and these drawbacks.
Yeah.
And then you present that to the decision maker and they say, well, you know what? If what you've said is right, and I trust that it is because, you're the expert, let's go with this.
Mm-hmm. No, that's it. It really is as simple as that, to be honest. It's, what are the best tools for the job? And it's never a reflection on the technology because the use cases there's myriad use cases for document extraction. You can't just say that, form recognizer is the last one and that's it, because it's far from it. Most of the SDKs are still in preview. And there is a risk there. It's being, going into production with a preview framework. But it also is a testament to to our opinion of the technology. And it was really a need for speed, which is not a phrase I've ever anticipated saying. But yeah, I joined and it was like, oh, we've got all these problems. The OCR is not quite there. It's very opinionated. It keeps trying to evaluate the text. We just want to look at the text. And I was like, okay, I'm going to go with an API based approach because that's light and it seems to fit that need. And it could be very well that there's other people in a similar situation who are using Azure, and actually they need a lot more in terms of evaluating the data that they don't have in their current stack. And Abby might be really good for that because it can do things like say, okay, I've extracted this and I see that it doesn't contain the thing you're expecting, so I'm going to send it over here. In a way, if you're living in Abby and you want it to be the major part of your stack, it's probably the way to go. But if OCR or text extraction is just a small part of a wider process, then I'd definitely say that you're looking more likely at the cloud-based providers.
And that makes sense. I like that you or someone on the team or a bunch of someone's on the team have done that due diligence, because it's so easy sometimes just to fall into, we'll use this technology because we've used it before. It doesn't fit this problem we're trying to solve, but we've used it before. And I think that fits well with what you were saying towards the beginning when you said about your definition of a full stack developer as someone who can sort of deeply grok a new library very quickly. Right, you have enough experience of reading through code, which I think is one of the most important skills as a developer, is reading other people's code. You have enough experience of reading that to be able to go, right, I know where the important bits are. Because, if you've got 200 lines of code and you're only looking at one method, you don't want to start at the top of the file and work your way down line at a time. You jump straight to where you need to be, and then you gather the context as you go. So I like that you've done that. And what I would really like to do is have a chat about bringing things into production when they're in preview. But I'm also very, very aware that you have a limited amount of time for us today. So maybe we'll have to table that for another call, another episode.
Sounds good. Yeah, it's a shame, but there's so much we could talk about in terms of the sort of journey we've been on recently. But a lot of it has been, it's been the bleeding edge. You've been we need a piece of technology that does X quickly. And that it's pretty scary, but Azure's been there for us. It's been an amazing tool, and it's another testament to C# as a language. There's this general purpose language that kind of does everything. It's obviously not the be all and end all. There are other languages which are perfect for specific use cases, just in the same way we've said for Abby and OCR. But, as a C# developer, I feel a lot of freedom. Like I feel like I can solve most problems, which is awesome.
Yeah, I like it. So what I'll say is, Nick, what about if people want to learn a little bit more about, maybe is there some documentation that you've read up recently, or can folks learn a little bit about the system that you've built perhaps, or getting in touch with you or learning about what you're doing? What are the best ways for folks to do that?
Yep. So you can get hold of me directly on Twitter. I'm just Nick Proud, or LinkedIn, the same handle. I post a lot about RPA and C# on YouTube as well. So if you just search for Nick Proud on YouTube, you'll find my videos there. I'm always looking for new ideas on content because maybe I'm not very imaginative. Maybe I just need help. So, if there's certain topics that you wanted to learn about, or, if Form recognizes that one of those, then just hit me up and let me know. And then in terms of the technology that I've been working on, you just search for Nexbotics. That's Nexbotix, and you'll see how we've been using .NET and Azure to build bot technology that brings humans into the loop.
Awesome. What I'll do is I'll collect a bunch of links and I'll make sure to put those in the show notes. So if anyone's listening along, they don't have to worry about how do you spell Nexbotics again. Don't worry about it. It's in the show notes. It's in the transcription, and there'll be a link right at the bottom of there as well. So go ahead and check those out and click through. But I guess all that really remains to say, Nick, is thank you for being on the show. I said it at the beginning, I'll say it again now. I really do say this every time, but I honestly do enjoy talking to everybody in the community. And I'm walking away from this conversation with, I'm going to go learn about form recognizer, and I'm going to do some looking into this automation stuff for different providers, right? Because there'll be different APIs everywhere. So, and everybody will do it slightly differently. Gives me a greater breadth of knowledge of what's out there. So, thank you ever so much, Nick.
My pleasure. And obviously, I forgot to say as well, the form recognizer docs from Microsoft are your best bet. So just search docs, form recognizer, you'll get everything you need.
Awesome. Well, thank you ever so much, Nick.
Cheers. Absolute pleasure. Thanks for having me on.
That was my interview with Nick Proud. Be sure to check the show notes for a bunch of links to some of the stuff that we covered and a full transcription of the interview. The show notes, as always, can be found at .netcore.show, and there will be a link directly to them in your podcatcher. And don't forget to spread the word. Leave a rating or review in your podcatcher of choice. Head over to .netcore.show/review for ways to do that, and to reach out via our contact page. That's at .netcore.show/contact. And of course, come back next time for more .NET goodness. I'll see you again real soon. See you later, folks. The .NET Core podcast is a production of RJJ Software Limited.